Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're opening a door that I will be completely honest with you, most of us usually keep triple locked and barricaded. We're going to take a really hard look at ourselves. And I don't mean looking in the mirror to check our hair or our outfits. I mean looking at the actual moral machinery that drives our daily decisions. Because, we really like to think of ourselves as the heroes of our own stories, right?
Oh, absolutely. Everyone is the good guy in their own narrative.
Exactly. We think we're rational, we're fair. If we see a wallet on the ground, we return it. If we see an injustice at work, we speak up. But the research we are covering today, well, that suggests that the mirror we're looking into might actually be a funhouse mirror. It's distorting reality to make us feel a lot better about ourselves.
It is definitely a distortion, and it's a scientifically measurable one at that. So today, we are diving into a book called Blind Spots, Why We Fail to Do What's Right and What to Do About It. It's written by Max Bazerman and Ann Ten Brunsell. And I want to set the stage here immediately for you listening. This isn't just some book about ethics in the boring corporate compliance sense where you sign a form and immediately forget about it.
Right, no HR training videos.
Exactly. No terrible acting in a break room video.
Yeah.
This is a foundational text in behavioral psychology. It completely dismantles the idea that bad things only happen because of, bad apples. It actually argues that the barrel itself, and specifically the way our human brains process the barrel, that is the real problem.
That's the hook that really grabbed me when I was reading through the source material. We aren't talking about cartoon villains twirling their mustaches in a dark room. We aren't talking about some mastermind planning a massive fraud from day one with purely malicious intent. We are talking about regular people. You, me, the listener on their commute right now, who genuinely truly believe they are acting ethically, but who are constantly tripping over what the authors call the ethical gap.
Yeah, the ethical gap. That is the core thesis of this entire deep dive. It is the distance, and honestly, sometimes it is a massive chasm between the person you think you are and the person you actually are. We have what they call the should self. That's the version of us that holds high moral standards, believes in fairness, wants to save the world, eats a salad, goes to the gym.
The aspirational self.
Right. And then we have the want self, which is who actually shows up when we are under pressure or tired or hungry or chasing a quarterly profit target.
And the really scary part is we don't even realize the want self has taken the wheel until it's entirely too late. But before we unpack the actual machinery of why that gap exists and how our brains trick us, I want to try a quick experiment with everyone listening. It's a classic interactive element straight from the research in the book. So I want you to take a second, maybe even pause the audio if you need to, and honestly rate your own ethicality.
Right. Do it on a scale of 0 to 100.
Exactly. 0 is, I don't know, I'm a total sociopath who steals candy from babies and kicks puppies. 100 is I'm a living saint, completely perfect in every single way. And 50 is average, just a regular middle-of-the-pack person. Where do you stand compared to the general population?
Lock in that number. Don't say it out loud. Just hold it in your head. Really think about it. Are you better than the guy driving in the lane next to you? Are you more honest than your boss? Are you fairer than your neighbors?
Got your number. Okay, so here is the reveal. And this comes straight from the hard data across thousands of participants in these exact studies. When researchers ask this question, almost everyone, and I mean almost everyone, rates themselves above a 75.
Which, if you think about it for literally more than 1 second, is mathematically impossible.
Right. The average has to be 50. That's literally how averages work. We can't all be better than average. It's like that old joke about Lake Wobegon, where all the children are above average. It's mathematically absurd. But this isn't just a funny psychological quirk. This statistical impossibility is the very first proof of the blind spot. We are walking around with an inflated sense of our own moral worth that literally defies the laws of mathematics.
And that inflated self-worth is incredibly dangerous. Because if you think you're already a 75 or an 80, you stop checking yourself. You just assume your gut instinct is always the moral one. And that is really the mission of this deep dive today. We aren't here to preach at you. We aren't here to tell you to just be better or to scold you. We want to use behavioral psychology to basically pop the hood on the human brain and expose the hidden mechanisms, these blind spots, that cause good people to do bad things without even realizing it. Because if you don't understand the machinery, you can't fix the output.
That makes total sense. So let's start with the actual concept that gives the book its title. The authors use a very specific term, bounded awareness.
Yeah.
And to explain it, they use a visual metaphor that I just think is so perfect. It involves a Dalmatian dog.
Yes, this is such a powerful image to understand how our brains filter reality on a daily basis. So imagine you were shown a picture. At first glance, it just looks like a chaotic mess of black and white splotches. It looks like abstract noise, or maybe a really grainy satellite photo of a snowy forest. You stare at it, and you see absolutely nothing but static. You try to find a pattern, but your brain just can't lock onto anything.
That's super frustrating. You feel like you're missing an inside joke or something.
Exactly. But then someone comes along and literally traces the outline of a Dalmatian, sniffing the ground right there within those spots. They point out the ear, the tail, the curve of the leg.
And suddenly, boom,
Yeah.
the dog just pops out of the static.
The chaos organizes itself into a shape instantly. And the truly fascinating thing here, the thing that explains bounded awareness perfectly, is that once you see the dog, you cannot unsee it. Every single time you look at that image forever after, you see the Dalmatian instantly. But before it was pointed out, your awareness was bound. The background noise literally kept you from seeing the reality standing right in front of your face.
And the core argument Bazerman and Ten Brunsell are making is that we have this exact same problem with ethics. We get so hyper-focused on the background, the business context, the profit margin, the looming deadline, the fierce competition, that we literally fail to see the ethical dilemma. It's not that we see the ethical issue and choose to ignore it. We literally do not see the dog.
We have blinders on. A really perfect real-world example from the sources is the story of a colleague of the author, Anne Ten Brunsell. This is a brilliant case study in how bounded awareness operates in high-stakes personal decisions. Now, this colleague was a smart, caring person. She was a devoted mother, and she decided not to vaccinate her children.
Now, hold on a second. I know mentioning vaccines can get intensely political. We aren't here to debate the medical science or take a political stance today. We want to look strictly at the psychology of her decision-making process, right?
Precisely. We are acting as neutral observers, analyzing the psychological frame she used. When she made that choice, she framed the decision entirely around parental rights and the perceived immediate risk to her own children. In her mind, she was being a highly protective, good mother. She was hyper-focused on her immediate circle. Her bounded awareness was strictly limited to her family unit.
Which, I mean, feels very intuitive. You protect your own kids first. That's evolutionary hardwiring.
It is. But here is where the blind spot comes in. Because her awareness was completely bound to her own family, she entirely excluded the risk to other children from her decision frame. Specifically, she ignored the risk to immune-compromised kids in the community who rely on herd immunity just to survive. She wasn't being malicious. She wasn't thinking, I don't care about those other sick kids. She just wasn't seeing the whole picture. The herd immunity part of the picture was just those black and white splotches to her. It was static.
And the text specifically mentions that when Anne actually pointed this out, when she essentially traced the Dalmatian, so to speak, and gently explained that this personal decision could essentially be a death sentence for someone else's vulnerable child, the colleague was absolutely horrified.
She changed her mind almost immediately once the frame was expanded, and that's the crucial takeaway here. She wasn't a bad person who needed to be punished or shamed into compliance. She was boundedly ethical. Once the blind spot was removed, once the scope of her awareness was widened by someone else, her behavior naturally aligned with her own core values. But without that external intervention, she was operating in a very dangerous gap.
This leads us perfectly into a really critical discussion about how we usually try to fix these things, especially in the corporate world. I mean, corporate America spends millions, maybe billions of dollars on ethics training every year. We sign the massive Code of Conduct handbook. We watch those cheesy, outdated videos about not bribing foreign officials. We take the multiple choice quiz at the end. And yet Enron happens. Madoff happens. The entire 2008 financial crash happens. Why is this traditional heavy-handed approach failing so spectacularly?
It fails because it fundamentally assumes that ethics is a knowledge problem. It operates on the assumption that if you just know the rules, you will naturally follow the rules. It assumes we are these perfectly rational actors who just need a better rule book to read from. But the authors pose a really provocative, almost funny question to test this theory. Do the people who know the absolute most about ethics actually behave better than the rest of us?
Oh, you're referring to the Schwitzgebel study regarding the library books. I have to say, I absolutely love this study. It's so petty and yet so deeply revealing of human nature. It's the kind of academic research that makes you laugh and then immediately cringe.
It is hilarious and a little tragic. So Eric Schwitzgebel is a philosophy professor, and he decided to rigorously test this theory. He went to academic university libraries, places frequented by tenured professors and PhD students, the intellectual elite. He analyzed the theft and missing book rates, and he specifically compared obscure philosophy textbooks on logic, metaphysics, epistemology against ethics books. We are talking about books specifically regarding morality, the categorical imperative, fundamental right versus wrong.
So surely the people borrowing the books on how to be a good moral person were more likely to return them properly, right?
You would certainly think so, but the hard data showed the exact opposite. The ethics books were 50% to 150% more likely to be stolen or permanently missing than the non-ethics philosophy books.
That is just incredible. The people dedicating their lives to studying ethics, the professional credentialed moralists, are the ones actually stealing the books on ethics.
Exactly. It essentially proves that knowing the theory does not translate to the behavior in the real world. You can know Immanuel Kant's philosophy inside and out. You can write a brilliant 400-page dissertation on utilitarianism and still quietly slip a book into your bag and steal it because you feel like you need it right now for your research.
Why do you think that happens, though? Is it just pure arrogance, like I'm a genius, the rules don't apply to me?
It could definitely be rationalization. The person thinks, well, I'm a very important professor. I need this crucial text for my groundbreaking research, so it's doing much more good with me at my desk than just sitting on the dusty library shelf. It's the want self justifying the action in real time. But on a broader level, this study completely destroys the traditional REST model of decision making.
The rest model, can you break that down?
Yeah, so James Rest developed this traditional psychological model that assumes human beings follow a linear logical process when making moral choices. Step 1, moral awareness. You clearly see the ethical problem. Step 2, moral judgment. You weigh the options and decide what's right. Step 3, moral intention. You make a firm plan to do the right thing. And step 4, moral action. You execute the plan. It treats us exactly like computers processing lines of code. Input A leads perfectly to output B.
But the stolen library book study, and basically all of modern behavioral psychology, says we aren't computers at all. We skip steps constantly.
We skip them all the time. In fact, we most often skip the awareness step entirely. We don't even realize we're making an ethical choice in the moment. And this brings us to the actual cognitive engine of the brain, the constant, unseen battle between System 1 and System 2 thinking. This is a concept made famous by the Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman, but it's absolutely crucial to understanding blind spots here.
Let's unpack this for the listener. System 1 is basically the fast lane, right?
Exactly. System 1 is fast, automatic, emotional, and highly intuitive. It operates completely under the radar. It's the system you use when you suddenly slam on the brakes because a car cuts you off on the highway. You don't sit there and think, I should logically apply downward pressure to the brake pedal to slowly reduce the velocity of my vehicle. No, you just react instantly. It's pure survival instinct.
And System 2 is the opposite.
Yes, System 2 is slow, deliberative, and highly logical. It's what you use to solve a really complex algebra problem or when you sit down to fill out a complicated tax form. It requires intense focus. It actually burns physical calories to keep System 2 running.
And the massive conflict here, as the text points out, is that System 1 is basically our want self, the primitive part of us that desperately wants comfort, survival, and immediate reward right now. And System 2 is the should self, the mature part, that knows we really should eat a salad instead of a burger, and that we should definitely return the library book.
The huge problem is most of our critical ethical decisions happen while we are stuck in System 1, especially when we are operating under any kind of time pressure. Jonathan Haidt did some truly fascinating experiments to prove this exact point using stories that are specifically designed to trigger that System 1 disgust reflex.
Oh, these are the stories about the flag and the dog.
Yeah.
They are really visceral. They are designed to make you deeply uncomfortable just hearing them.
They are completely designed to make you squirm in your seat. In one story, Haidt tells participants about a woman who has an old American flag. She doesn't want to just throw it away in the trash, so she cuts it up into pieces and uses it as a cleaning rag to scrub her private bathroom. In the other story, a family's beloved pet dog is hit by a car in front of their house and killed instantly. The family had always heard that dog meat is actually delicious, so they decide to butcher and cook the dog and eat it for dinner that night.
Seriously, even just hearing that out loud, my stomach turns. My brain immediately screams, that's wrong. That's incredibly disrespectful. That's just gross.
Right. And that immediate reaction, that visceral, that is pure System 1 firing. It's instantaneous. Haidt found that people immediately and aggressively say these things are morally reprehensible. But then he did something brilliant. He asked them to logically explain exactly why it was morally wrong, and they completely struggled.
Because if you actually force yourself to think about it with the logical System 2, using the flag as a rag isn't technically illegal. It's her personal property. She's doing it in the absolute privacy of her own home. And eating the dog, When the dog is already dead, it didn't suffer for the meal, so it isn't causing any new pain. It's just socially weird and repulsive to us.
Exactly. But the participants couldn't easily articulate that logic. They would literally stutter, wave their hands, and just say, I don't know, it's just wrong. What hate proved is that we invoke logic strictly after the fact to justify the disgust we already feel. They are just rationalizing the initial gut feeling.
So we aren't impartial judges sitting on a bench weighing the objective evidence of a situation. We are actually just highly paid defense lawyers for our own gut feelings.
That is the perfect analogy. We judge first based entirely on emotion and intuition in System 1, and then we scramble to use System 2 to build a very smart-sounding legal case to support that initial emotion. We do not use logic to find the truth. We use logic to defend our intuition.
That is honestly a terrifying thought because it implies we can rationalize almost anything, any behavior at all, if our primitive gut just tells us to do it in the heat of the moment. So if our want self is the one actually driving the bus most of the time, how does a massive ethical failure play out in real time? The book breaks this down into a really clear timeline: prediction, action, and recollection.
It's essentially a psychological tragedy in 3 acts. We are effectively 3 entirely different people during this timeline. Phase 1 is prediction. This occurs before the event and is almost always done by the should self. When we look into the future, we look at the forest, the big picture, our grand principles, our highest values. We confidently predict we will be heroic.
This is literally me on Sunday night planning my diet for the week. I tell myself I will eat kale every day. I will go to the gym at 5 a.m. I will be an absolute machine of discipline.
Exactly. We all do it. We believe we will boldly stand up to workplace harassment. We will bravely refuse unfair demands from a boss. We will be incredibly charitable with our money. There was a landmark study by Woodzika and LaFrance regarding sexual harassment that perfectly and somewhat tragically illustrates this massive gap. They gathered a large group of women and asked them a hypothetical question. If a job interviewer asked you highly inappropriate sexualized questions during a job interview, what would you do?
And I assume they all predicted they would fight back aggressively.
Overwhelmingly, yes. They boldly said, I'd walk right out of the room, I'd report him to HR immediately, I'd tell him off to his face. They predicted intense confrontation because they were viewing the hypothetical situation safely through the lens of their core values. But then the researchers actually did it. They set up a fake job interview, put these same women in a very real-feeling high-pressure situation, and had an actor ask those exact inappropriate questions.
And what was the actual result?
Almost all of them remained completely silent. Many of them even nervously smiled and politely answered the wildly inappropriate questions. They were completely paralyzed.
Why is there such a massive disconnect? Were they just lying in the prediction phase?
No, they weren't lying at all. They truly believed their own predictions. But in the actual moment, which is phase 2, the environment changes everything. The want self aggressively takes over. The cognitive focus shifts from the forest of my high values to the trees of the immediate terrifying pragmatics, the immediate fear, the shock of the moment, the intense desire to get the job, the heavy social pressure to be polite to an authority figure. All those visceral forces completely crowd out the ethical plan.
Wow. So phase 2 is where the wheels completely fall off the wagon.
Yes. And the absolute biggest compounding factor in phase 2 is time pressure. When we are rushed, System 2 just completely shuts down to save energy. We instantly revert to survival mode. And the absolute definitive historical case study here for organizational failure is the Ford Pinto.
This is a really heavy one. I think a lot of people probably know the basic headline exploding cars in the 70s, but the specific details in the source material really paint a grim, almost unbelievable picture of how corporate structure forces ethical fating on a massive scale.
It really is the ultimate masterclass in organizational failure. Context is so key here. It was the early 1970s. Ford was a massive American icon, but they were suddenly getting absolutely crushed in the market by Volkswagen's cheap, efficient Beetle, and the Japanese imports were starting to flood in. Lee Iacocca, the powerful president of Ford, desperately wanted a subcompact car to compete, and he wanted it incredibly fast.
This was the famous rule of 2000, right?
Right. He mandated a strict goal. He wanted a car that weighed under 2,000 pounds and cost under $2,000 for the consumer. And to hit that, he massively compressed the engineering schedule. The Pinto production schedule was drastically truncated down to just 25 months instead of the industry standard 43 months. That is an unbelievable amount of time pressure to put on engineers.
And during the rushed crash tests, they found a critical flaw.
They did. The gas tank was positioned somewhat precariously behind the rear axle. It was a known design trade-off to maximize trunk space in a tiny car. But they found through testing that if the car got rear-ended at just 20 miles per hour, a minor fender bender, the tank would be pushed forward into the differential housing, it would rupture, fuel would spray directly into the passenger compartment, and a single spark could turn the entire car into a fireball.
And they knew this before the car officially launched to the public.
They knew. They absolutely, unequivocally knew. The engineers had the data. But here is exactly where the want self and System 1 thinking entirely takes over an organization. They didn't view this glaring data as an ethical decision about burning families alive on the highway. They viewed it strictly as a complex business decision. They ran a cold, calculated cost-benefit analysis, which became the infamous Pinto memo.
They literally put a specific dollar price tag on a human life.
They did. They calculated that it would cost exactly $11 per car to install a simple plastic baffle to protect the tank and fix the flaw. $11. They then weighed that total manufacturing cost against the estimated financial cost of simply paying out lawsuits for the projected deaths and horrific burn injuries. They used government data to estimate a human life was worth about $200,000 in a court settlement. And the final math said, it is technically cheaper for the corporation to let people burn and just pay the lawsuits than to spend the $11 per car to fix it on the assembly line. So they launched the car as is.
That is just chilling to hear out loud. It sounds like pure, unadulterated evil.
Yeah.
Just listening to the cold math of it, I immediately want to label those Ford executives as utter monsters. But the really scary part, the part you mentioned earlier, is that these weren't evil cartoon villains in their daily lives.
No, they really weren't. They were regular guys. They were churchgoers, little league coaches, fathers, respected community leaders. Dennis Gioia, who was actually the recall coordinator at Ford during this exact time, has spoken about this extensively in his academic career since. He says that in the room at the time, he genuinely didn't feel like he was doing anything morally wrong. He was just a guy in a suit solving a complex math problem to maximize profit for his employer. The ethical dimension had completely faded from view. They were boundedly ethical. They were so intensely focused on the narrow goal, the rule of 2000 and the compressed timeline, that the actual morality of the decision didn't even register in their brains until it was far, far too late and people were dying.
Which brings us to the final phase. Phase 3, recollection. Because after the horrific disaster, after the harassment in the interview, after the terrible business decision, how do we possibly live with ourselves? How did those Ford executives go home and sleep at night knowing what they signed off on?
We all become incredibly skilled revisionist historians. We desperately have to restore our self-image because our human brains absolutely hate cognitive dissonance. We simply cannot hold the belief I am a fundamentally good, decent person and I knowingly killed people to save $11 in the same brain at the same time. It breaks the system. So we rewrite the memory. We use what psychologists call psychological cleansing.
The book mentions a wild study about literally washing your hands here.
Yes, it's known as the Macbeth effect. There was a very real study showing that literally, physically washing your hands with soap and water can measurably reduce the psychological feelings of guilt after you commit an unethical behavior. It physically washes away the sin in our subconscious minds. It's exactly like Shakespeare out, damn spot.
Wow. And if we can't wash it away, we just deflect the blame onto someone else?
Constantly. We say, well, I was just following orders, much like the participants in the famous Milgram experiments who were willing to administer lethal shocks to strangers just because a guy wearing a gray lab coat sternly told them the experiment required it. Or in the corporate world, we say, hey, the lawyers reviewed it and said it was technically legal, so my hands are tied. We hide behind the corporate hierarchy. Or we just spin the language to soften the blow. We don't call it a lie. We call it a strategic misrepresentation. We don't call it stealing from clients. We call it aggressive creative accounting.
The book talks a lot about the slippery slope in this phase, too. The specific example of billing hours really struck a chord with me because it highlights just how slow and insidious the moral fade actually is. It rarely happens overnight with one massive crime.
Oh, absolutely. It almost always starts incredibly small. Imagine you are a young, stressed lawyer or a management consultant. You work a solid 45-minute task for a client. You quickly round it up to a clean 1 hour on your timesheet. It's no big deal, right? It's just 15 measly minutes. Everyone in the firm does it. But that tiny action shifts your psychological baseline forever. Your brain normalizes the discrepancy. Next week, you're a bit short on your quota, so you round up 30 minutes. 6 months later, without even really making a conscious choice to become a criminal, you're routinely overbilling 10 full hours a week. You haven't decided to be a brazen thief. You just slowly slid down the slope, rationalizing every inch, until the fraudulent behavior was just standard operating procedure. You are now technically stealing thousands of dollars from clients, but you still look in the mirror and feel like an entirely honest, hardworking professional.
So to summarize the timeline, we confidently predict we'll be moral heroes, we act like complete cowards or selfish opportunists when under pressure, and then we magically remember ourselves as helpless victims of circumstance or just savvy business people.
That is the exact life cycle of an ethical fail. And it happens to all of us every single day, usually in much smaller ways than the Ford Pinto, obviously. But the cognitive mechanism running the software is exactly the same.
Okay, I want to pivot to the next major section of the source material because this is where it gets highly personal for the listener. We've talked extensively about how we fool ourselves about our own direct actions. Now let's talk about the deeply ingrained biases that completely blind us to our own prejudices.
This is a tough section on biases, and we really have to start with the phrase that everyone absolutely loves to say defensively. I'm not biased. I don't see color. I treat everyone exactly the same. I just look at the pure merit of the individual.
Right, it's the standard modern defense. I have a black friend, I voted for Obama, my company has a diversity statement, therefore I am immune to prejudice. But the hard science suggests completely otherwise.
The science suggests we are deeply, profoundly deluding ourselves. This brings us straight into the field of implicit psychology and a very famous tool called the IAT, the Implicit Association Test.
I've actually taken this test online.
Right.
It is incredibly frustratingly difficult to do.
It is notoriously difficult. And for the listeners who haven't ever taken it, here is exactly how the mechanics of it work. The IAT doesn't ask you your opinions. It strictly measures physical reaction time in milliseconds. It's not about what you logically think, it's about how fast your neurons fire in your brain. You sit at a computer keyboard and you have to rapidly sort images of faces, either black faces or white faces, and words, either good words like joy and peace, or bad words like evil and hurt, into categories using just 2 keys on the keyboard.
So for example, the left key is for white faces and good words, and the right key is for black faces and bad words.
Exactly. And when white and good are paired together on the exact same key, the reaction times are incredibly fast for most white participants. Your brain makes that cultural association very smoothly and quickly. But then, halfway through, the categories switch. When black and good are suddenly paired on the same exact key, the reaction times measurably slow down. People start making mistakes, they hesitate.
And that tiny split-second delay, that physical stutter in the fingers, that is the bias revealing itself.
It perfectly reveals the ingrained neural pathways. It shows mathematically that your brain literally has to work harder and take more time to associate black with good. And the truly crazy part is, even people who genuinely consciously believe they are strict egalitarians, people who literally march for civil rights and donate to equality causes, often show this exact same implicit bias. It operates completely beneath conscious awareness. It's the background operating software running silently on your computer while you're trying to type a document.
And this hidden software feeds directly into what they call in-group favoritism, which is a really important distinction the authors make. We often think prejudice requires active, conscious malice or deep hatred. We think of people in white hoods or neo-Nazis marching in the street. But often, it's not that at all. It's just quietly giving extra points to people who look and act like us.
Exactly. It's not necessarily about aggressively punishing the outgroup. It's about subtly, comfortably privileging the in-group. Take mortgage lending, for example.
Yeah.
The source specifically mentions that white loan officers were significantly more likely to approve marginal loans for white applicants than black applicants.
Okay, wait, let's define that. So if an application is absolutely perfect, stellar credit, huge down payment, everyone gets approved, regardless of race. And if it's terrible, everyone gets denied. But in the gray area, the marginal applications...
Right, in that messy gray area where human judgment comes in, the white loan officer looks at a white applicant's slightly flawed file and thinks, you know, he seems like a really good, hardworking guy. He kind of reminds me of my nephew. He just had a run of bad luck. Let's give him a break and approve it. They don't actively look at the black applicant's file and think, I hate this person, I want to ruin their life. They just don't extend that exact same warm benefit of the doubt. They stick rigidly to the exact letter of the rules for the out-group, but they happily bend the rules for the in-group.
But the net result in the real world is still massive systemic discrimination.
Massive discrimination. But the perpetrator sleeps perfectly fine because they feel like they were just helping a fellow out. They feel generous and benevolent. We see the exact same psychological mechanism with legacy admissions at Ivy League universities. It's essentially affirmative action for the already wealthy and highly connected who are predominantly white. To the alumni, it just feels like honoring tradition or building a strong campus community, but it systematically, mathematically excludes brilliant students from other demographics who just don't have that generational access.
That makes so much sense.
Yeah.
Another major bias the book hits on is egocentrism. And they use a survey question that I think literally every single couple in the world has fought about at some point. Housework.
Oh, yeah, the housework question is the absolute perfect, most relatable illustration of overclaiming credit. Researchers sit down with married spouses separately and ask them a simple question. What percentage of the total housework do you personally do? They ask the husband in one room, then they ask the wife in the other room.
And let me guess, the two numbers do not cleanly add up to 100%.
Never, not once. The combined total is almost always around 120% or even 130%. The husband confidently says, well, I do about 40%, and the wife confidently says, I definitely do 80%.
Why does this happen so consistently? Is it just pure arrogance? Is the husband just straight up lying to the researcher?
No, it's not lying, and it's not arrogance, it's memory availability. I vividly, physically remember every single time I took out the heavy trash. I remember the bad smell, the cold air outside, the weight of the bag, the physical effort it took. It is permanently burned into my neural memory. But I do not see or feel it when my spouse quietly scrubs the toilet while I'm out of the house at work. I don't vividly remember when they fold my laundry because I didn't experience the effort. We overclaim credit because we are fundamentally the center of our own universe. We only have direct access to our own sensory data stream.
And this egocentric bias isn't just about arguments over dishes or taking out the trash. The book actually connects this exact same quirk of the brain to massive global crises, like overfishing the oceans and global climate change.
Yes, the fishing crisis simulation is brilliant. Researchers put people in groups and say, all right, here is a simulated lake with a limited number of fish. You can harvest what you want to make money. They let the participants talk it out, discuss what a fair strategy would be, and then everyone privately decides how much to harvest.
And they completely destroy the lake, don't they?
Every single time. The fish population collapses. Because everyone in the group defines the word fair in a way that slightly subconsciously favors themselves. One guy thinks, well, I have a bigger boat, so it's only fair I take a bit more to pay for my fuel. Another thinks, I have a larger crew to feed, so my fair share is higher. Another says, I caught way less last season, so the universe owes me this year. Everyone takes just a little bit more than their mathematical share, genuinely believing they are acting completely fairly, and the entire shared resource collapses.
Which explains exactly why global climate change negotiations are such an absolute nightmare. Every single country sincerely thinks they're doing their fair share of reducing emissions and that everyone else is just slacking off and taking advantage of them.
Exactly right. It's the housework argument, but it's egocentrism scaled up to a geopolitical level with the fate of the planet at stake. We automatically interpret the complex data in a way that perfectly serves our own self-interest, and we call it justice.
Okay, moving on to the next major concept, seeing no evil. We've talked a lot about our own bad behavior and how we justify it. But what about when we clearly see other people doing bad things right in front of us? Why do we so often stay totally silent? I mean, why did no one stop the Catholic Church abuse for decades? Why did no one stop the rampant steroid era in baseball when it was so obvious?
This phenomenon is called motivated blindness. It's the deeply ingrained psychological idea that we simply do not see unethical behavior when it is in our own best interest not to see it. If acknowledging the ugly truth is going to hurt me financially, socially, or professionally, my brain will actually subconsciously choose to edit out that truth. I won't even see it.
The baseball steroid era of the late 90s is just the absolute classic textbook example here.
It really is. Think about the late 1990s in America. Mark McGwire, Sammy Sosa, Barry Bonds. They were hitting home runs at completely impossible superhuman rates. Historic records that had stood for many decades were just being utterly smashed every single week. And the players were physically mutating before our eyes. Their heads were getting massive. Their bodies were gigantic. They had severe acne on their backs. It was painfully obvious to literally anyone with functioning eyes that something deeply chemical was happening.
But Major League Baseball as an industry was absolutely booming at the time.
Exactly. You have to remember the context. After the disastrous players' strike in '94, baseball was basically dying. The fans had left. The great home run race brought all those fans rushing back. The team owners were making absolute fortunes. The television networks were setting ratings records. The players' union was thrilled with the massive new contracts, and the fans were highly entertained. Every single stakeholder in the sport had a massive financial and emotional incentive to just look at those cartoonishly huge muscles and say, wow, he must have a really great new off-season workout routine.
So the executives didn't necessarily sit in a smoky back room and actively conspire to cover it up.
Mm.
They just genuinely collectively blinded themselves to the stark reality because the reality would have instantly ruined the massive party they were all enjoying.
Yes, precisely. The commissioner didn't want to know. The owners didn't want to know. The media didn't press too hard because they wanted access. It's a systemic, willful ignorance entirely fueled by profit. We saw the exact same mechanism with the credit rating agencies leading up to the 2008 financial collapse. The big banks essentially paid the rating agencies to rate their complex mortgage bonds. If an agency did their job properly and gave a bad, honest rating to a toxic bond, the bank would just take their millions of dollars in fees down the street to a friendlier, different agency. So the agencies were heavily financially motivated to see AAA pristine quality in what was actually absolute garbage junk. They were literally paid millions to be blind.
There's another fascinating type of blindness the book discusses, indirect blindness. This is what I call the dirty work problem.
Yes. We universally judge dirty work much, much less harshly if it's outsourced to a third party. If I personally walk up and punch you in the face, society agrees that is bad. But if I hire a guy to walk up and punch you in the face, studies show people judge me slightly less harshly because my hands didn't do the striking. The Merck pharmaceutical example in the text is absolutely fascinating on this point.
Right. Let's walk through that. So, scenario A. A giant drug company decides to aggressively raise the price of a critical, life-saving cancer drug by 300% overnight. We inherently hate them.
We call them greedy monsters. We drag their CEO before a congressional hearing to yell at them on TV. But then consider scenario B. That same drug company quietly sells the patent rights to that exact drug to a smaller, obscure, no-name firm. And then that new, smaller firm immediately raises the price by 300%.
But the original big company still heavily profits from the sale, right? They get a
Yeah.
massive cut of the future revenue.
Correct. They still get the money. But public polling shows that people are significantly less outraged at the original big company. The public feels they kind of wash their hands of the dirty deed. This psychological loophole is exactly why massive global companies outsource their manufacturing to developing nations with terrible labor laws. The CEO can proudly stand up and say, "We do not employ child labor or run sweatshops." Well, no, you don't. But your primary supplier in Bangladesh certainly might. And we, the buying consumers, eagerly let the big brand off the hook because of that one thin layer of corporate separation. We desperately want the cheap shoes, and we just don't want to know how the sausage is made.
It's basically an optical illusion of moral responsibility. And finally, rounding out this section on biases, we have the outcome bias. This is our deep tendency to judge the quality of a decision purely based on how it happened to turn out, rather than judging the actual process used to make the decision.
It's the classic no harm, no foul rule we use as kids. Imagine a medical researcher deliberately fudges clinical trial data to get a lucrative new drug approved by the FDA. He knowingly lies. If the drug accidentally turns out to be totally safe and highly effective in the real world, the public thinks, he really shouldn't have lied, but it's basically fine. It worked out. He cured people. But if that exact same drug kills 10 people, we say, he is a murderous monster who deserves life in prison.
But the core ethical action, the act of fudging the data, was exactly the same in both parallel universes.
Right. True ethics shouldn't depend on dumb luck, but we constantly judge based on the final outcome. This is incredibly dangerous in business because it means we routinely reward wildly reckless behavior just because someone got lucky. If a hotshot CEO takes a massive, totally irresponsible gamble with company funds and it miraculously pays off, we call him a visionary genius and put him on the cover of Forbes magazine. If the exact same gamble fails, we fire him and call him an idiot. But the actual risk profile was identical. We shouldn't wait for a literal or financial body count to firmly decide if a process was unethical.
That brings us perfectly into Section 5. We've looked deeply at the flawed individual. Now let's scale up and look at the whole organization. This is where the road to hell is truly paved with the best of intentions. Companies really do try to fix this stuff, right? They have massive compliance programs, thick codes of conduct, ethics hotlines. But the book heavily argues these corporate fixes often spectacularly backfire.
They backfire constantly and spectacularly. This is a concept known as the perversity of rewards. The absolute most famous textbook example here is the daycare study conducted by economists Nisi and Rusticchini.
I absolutely love this story. It's about parents picking up their kids from a daycare center in Haifa, Israel.
So this particular daycare had a persistent, annoying problem. Parents were routinely arriving late to pick up their children at the end of the day, which was forcing the exhausted teachers to stay late unpaid. It was a real nuisance. So the economist consulted with the daycare and suggested a perfectly logical capitalist solution. Introduce a financial fine. If you're late to pick up your kid, you pay a cash penalty.
Which is basic economics 101.
Mm.
If you increase the financial cost of a bad behavior, the frequency of that behavior should logically decrease.
Exactly. But in reality, the exact opposite happened. The rate of lateness didn't drop. It skyrocketed. It went way up.
Why? Logically, that makes absolutely no sense.
It makes no sense to an economist, but it makes perfect sense to a psychologist if you understand the concept of the frame. Because introducing the financial fine fundamentally changed the psychological frame of the entire interaction. Before the fine existed, picking up your kid late was a clear violation of a social norm. It was rude. You were personally inconveniencing a teacher who cared for your child. You felt deep guilt apologizing at the door. Guilt was the primary currency regulating the behavior.
Okay, so guilt and social shame were acting as the brakes.
Yes. But once the daycare put a literal price tag on the lateness, it instantly transformed from a social norm into a market norm. You were no longer being rude. You were simply purchasing a service. The parents thought, hey, I am paying $10 to buy an extra 30 minutes of babysitting. I bought this time fair and square. The guilt completely evaporated. The fine was just a fee.
That is endlessly fascinating to me. So the introduction of a penalty actually destroyed the underlying moral obligation.
Completely destroyed it. And the real kicker. A few weeks later, when the daycare realized the fine was a massive failure and they officially removed it, the high lateness rates stayed high. They didn't drop back down. The invisible moral contract between the parents and teachers was permanently broken and couldn't just be magically restored by removing the fine. Once you turn a human relationship into a financial transaction, it is incredibly hard to go back.
We see this perversity in corporate goal setting too. The Sears Auto Center scandal in the 1990s is the absolute textbook example of goals gone wrong.
Right. Sears corporate management wanted to urgently increase speed and profit in their auto repair shops. So they gave their mechanics a strict, hard quota. You must generate exactly $147 of repair work per hour, or you face consequences.
And what actually happened on the shop floor?
Mechanics almost immediately started fixing things that weren't remotely broken. They were recommending entire brake replacements on perfectly good brakes just to hit that magic $147 number to keep their jobs.
And again, is that because Sears accidentally hired a bunch of inherently evil mechanics?
Not at all. It's because of a phenomenon called goal shielding. When you give a human being a very narrow, highly pressured target like speed or profit, they focus on that target so intensely that their brain shields out and completely ignores every other consideration, including basic honesty, customer safety, and long-term reputation. The intense pressure of the goal actually created the widespread fraud. If you pay people strictly to do X, they will absolutely do X, even if they have to cheat, lie, and steal to do it.
There's also this bizarre psychological concept of moral compensation. This is the idea that doing something objectively good actually gives our brain a license to do something bad shortly after.
Yes, the moral bank account. We tend to subconsciously treat our personal ethics like a checking account balance. There was a remarkable study where they had participants buy green, environmentally friendly products from a store. Afterwards, in a seemingly totally unrelated separate task, those exact same people who bought the green products were measurably more likely to cheat on a math test in order to earn unearned money.
No way. That's
Yeah.
so counterintuitive.
It's totally true. They felt their moral bank account was flush with cash. They subconsciously thought, well, I just saved the planet by buying recycled paper towels, so I deserve to cheat a little bit on this test to get $5. It's rarely conscious, but the effect is highly measurable. It perfectly explains why some massive billionaire philanthropists can be absolutely ruthless, terrible people in their daily business dealings. They truly feel they've bought and paid for the right to be bad.
And then there is the disclosure fallacy. We see this all the time in modern media and finance. The attitude of, hey, I have a massive conflict of interest, but I'm openly telling you about it right now, so it's totally fine.
The coin jar study perfectly explains why this is a terrible idea. So in the experiment, you have advisors and estimators. The advisors are sitting close and can see a large glass jar of coins very clearly. The estimators are far away and can't see it well at all. The catch is, the advisors are paid more money if the estimators guess a really high number for the value of the jar.
So the advisor has a direct financial incentive to lie to the estimator and say there are way more coins in there than there actually are.
Right. Now, in one specific version of the experiment, the rules state the advisor must explicitly disclose the conflict of interest to the estimator. They have to say, hey, I get paid if you guess high. Now, logically, you would think this forced transparency would help the estimator mentally discount the bad advice, and it would socially pressure the advisor to be more honest.
Right, because I am explicitly warning you that I'm biased, so I shouldn't try to rip you off too badly.
But the data showed the exact opposite happened. When they formally disclosed the conflict, the advisors actually lied significantly more. They wildly exaggerated the value of the jar even higher than when it was a secret.
Wait, why? That makes zero sense.
Because the simple act of disclosure made the advisors feel completely absolved of any guilt. It's a psychological loophole. They thought, hey, I clearly warned you I'm a shark, so now I am totally free to bite you as hard as I want. It's a legalistic disclaimer that actually acts as a moral permission slip for worse behavior.
That is totally mind-blowing. So forced transparency can actually make the bias and the cheating worse if it's just used as a shield to deflect responsibility.
Absolutely. If it's not handled with other structural checks, disclosure alone can be highly toxic.
Okay, I want to briefly touch on the absolute highest societal level of this before we get to the solutions, and that is the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster. We talked about the Ford Pinto, but the Challenger explosion is a very specific, tragic failure of data analysis and corporate groupthink.
It is a devastating case study, and specifically, it is a failure of looking at the completely wrong subset of data. The engineers at the contractor, Morton Thiokol, deeply suspected the rubber O-rings on the booster rockets had critical issues sealing properly in cold weather. So the night before the launch, they looked at the historical data of previous launches where the O-rings had shown signs of failure. And sure enough, almost all of those problematic launches happened on colder days.
So the data confirmed their fears. Why on earth did they still agree to launch?
Because they suffered from a massive, fatal blind spot. They completely failed to look at the other half of the data, the launches, without any O-ring failures. If they had just pulled the data on the totally successful launches, they would have clearly seen that every single one of them happened in warm weather temperatures. By strictly looking only at the failures, they entirely missed the undeniable mathematical correlation between temperature and safety. They looked at a biased, narrow subset of data instead of the whole picture.
And the intense management pressure from NASA basically sealed the deal.
Yes, the famous tragic quote from that midnight meeting. A frustrated executive finally told the lead engineer who was protesting the launch, "Take off your engineering hat and put on your management hat."
Just hearing that phrase gives me absolute chills knowing what happened the next morning.
It is the literal spoken sound of ethical fading. The executive was saying, stop thinking about the objective facts and human safety and start thinking entirely about the PR schedule and the massive political pressure. And the next morning, 7 brave people died on national television because of it.
Okay, wow. So we have thoroughly depressed everyone listening. We have brutally exposed the gaps, the blind spots, the cognitive failures, the exploded cars, the stolen library books, the rig systems. Now we have to actually try to fix it. We need practical solutions. How do we, as individuals and leaders, start narrowing this ethical gap?
Well, the very first and most important takeaway from the entire book is that we absolutely cannot just try harder. Brute force willpower is statistically proven to be completely useless here. We need systemic, structural, behavioral changes.
Let's start with personal, individual solutions. The book talks about a concept called anticipating the want self. What does that mean in practice?
Right. It means you have to stop planning for the ideal you. Stop assuming you'll be a hero. You have to actively plan for the real you. You must plan for the absolute certainty that in the critical moment, you will be tired, you will be hungry, and you will be under immense social pressure.
So don't just idly say to yourself, I will definitely speak up if I see accounting fraud at my company.
Exactly. Instead, you say to yourself, when I am eventually pressured by my boss to fudge the quarterly numbers, I will likely feel deeply scared and I will desperately want to just comply to keep my job. Therefore, knowing that, I need to have a specific written script ready in my desk. Or even better, I need a pre-commitment.
What exactly is a pre-commitment?
It's a way to lock your future self in. You publicly announce your rigid intention before the pressure ever hits. You tell your whole team, hey, everyone, I will never sign off on any audit without physically checking these 3 specific metrics myself every time. Make it highly socially painful for your future self to back down. You are essentially binding your weak want self before it even wakes up and tries to take control.
And what about the veil of ignorance? This is a concept from John Rawls, the famous
Right.
philosopher, right?
Yes, and this is a brilliant tool for solving the egocentrism problem we discussed earlier. When you are sitting down to decide how to split up a shared resource like the fishing game, or a company bonus pool, or a chore chart, you must decide on the fair rules of division before you actually know which specific role you will be playing.
Okay, so it's like the old rule for kids. One kid cuts the slice of cake, but the other kid gets to choose which piece they want. You cut the cake fairly because you don't know which slice you're going to get stuck with.
That is the exact mechanism. If you don't know if you're going to be the big, powerful boat or the little struggling boat in the simulation, you will automatically, selfishly design a system that is fundamentally fair and protective for everyone, simply because you might end up being the little guy.
Moving on to organizational solutions. What can big companies actually do besides printing out those useless posters that just say integrity and hanging them in the hallway?
Burn the useless posters for a start. Leaders need to actively look for what the authors call sinkholes.
Sinkholes, like
Yeah,
structural traps.
exactly. Sinkholes are specific areas or departments within a company characterized by high uncertainty, incredibly high time pressure, and deep physical or social isolation. These three factors combined are the absolute perfect breeding grounds for systemic, unethical behavior. If you have a rogue department that is totally walled off from the rest of the company, constantly under the gun to produce, and working in a highly complex gray area of the law, you have a massive sinkhole. And fraud is almost certainly happening right now.
So you have to shine a light on those areas.
Hmm.
And you also have to aggressively align the formal and informal reward systems.
This is critical, yes. If the beautiful corporate poster on the wall says integrity and teamwork, but the actual year-end bonus system strictly pays out based on speed at all costs, I guarantee you the bonus system wins the battle every single time. People listen to where the money is, not what the poster says. You have to totally overhaul and fix the hidden incentives.
And we also need to fix our language. We talked earlier about euphemisms and how they hide the truth.
You have to ruthlessly eliminate them from your corporate vocabulary. Call it lying. Do not call it strategic misrepresentation. Call it stealing from the client. Do not call it creative allocation. The language we use literally frames our psychological reality. If you use sterile clinical language, you will breed sterile, numb consciences in your employees. Force people to use the ugly, real words for bad actions.
Finally, let's talk about societal solutions. This largely revolves around the architecture of defaults.
This is behavioral economics 101, but its impact is incredibly powerful at a national scale. Just look at the real-world data on organ donation rates.
The stark difference in rates between, say, Germany and Austria
Hmm.
is just wild to look at on a graph.
It's a massive life or death difference. In nations that use an opt-in system, like the United States or Germany, when you go to the DMV, you actually have to actively check a physical box on a form to become an organ donor. Because of that tiny bit of friction, donation rates in those countries are tragically low, hovering around 12 to 40%.
Right, because doing absolutely nothing means you automatically do not donate. System 1 takes over, we are lazy, we skip the box.
Exactly. But in opt-out nations like Austria or France, the default assumption is that you are an organ donor unless you actively check a box to stop them from taking your organs. Because of that single flip in the default architecture, their donation rates are a staggering 99%.
Because in that system, doing nothing means you automatically donate and save a life.
Human beings will almost always follow the path of least resistance. Smart policymakers can literally save thousands of lives simply by changing the default setting on a government form. It requires absolutely no grand moral persuasion, no expensive ad campaigns, just a simple form change. You just make the objectively good choice, the easiest possible choice for the lazy human brain to make.
And there's also the MPG illusion. This mathematically blew my mind when I read it in the source material.
It's a great example of counterintuitive math messing with our ethics. We naturally think that upgrading a car from 30 miles per gallon up to a super efficient 50 miles per gallon saves a massive ton of gas. But mathematically, upgrading an old, terrible truck from 12 mpg to just 14 mpg actually saves significantly more total gallons of gas over the exact same distance.
Because the 12 mpg gas guzzler is already burning through so much sheer volume of fuel that even a tiny 2-point improvement saves hundreds of gallons.
Right. But our System 1 brain stupidly focuses on the bigger jump in the numbers. 30 to 50 feels bigger and better than 12 to 14. We need entirely better metrics designed for human brains, like shifting to a gallons per 10,000 miles metric, to easily help normal people make the most ethical, impactful environmental choices when buying a car. We desperately need to present complex data in a way that our primitive System 1 can actually understand intuitively without doing algebra.
Man, so we have covered an incredible amount of ground today, all the way from a hidden Dalmatian dog and a static image to the horrific Challenger disaster, to organ donation checkboxes. What is the final overarching thought we should leave with here? How do we wrap up this intense deep dive into our own psychological flaws?
I think we really have to go all the way back to the title of the book, Blind Spots. The absolute most dangerous person in any room, in any company, is the person who confidently believes they are totally immune to these biases. The person who proudly says, I am a highly ethical person, I would simply never do that. That person is incredibly vulnerable.
Because they aren't even looking at the mirror anymore. They've stopped checking their blind spots.
Exactly. True critical thinking isn't just about applying logic to external problems. It's fundamentally about auditing your own internal gut feelings. It's about recognizing the exact moment when your primitive want self is quietly taking the wheel. At its core, it's about deep humility.
So here's a final challenge for you, the listener. The next time you face a complex business decision or a really high-stakes, time-sensitive choice at work, I want you to just pause, just stop for one single second, and ask yourself the classic newspaper test.
Right. Ask yourself, if this exact decision I am about to make was printed on the front page of my local newspaper tomorrow morning, detailing exactly what I did, who it hurt, and exactly why I did it, how would I truly feel reading it over coffee?
If the honest answer to that question is queasy or defensive or ashamed, stop immediately. You have just successfully found a blind spot.
Closing the massive gap between who we desperately want to be and who we actually act like under pressure is a lifelong daily project. But the very first step of that project is simply opening your eyes to the fact that the gap exists.
Well said. Thanks for diving deep with us today. Stay curious about your own mind, stay incredibly humble, and whatever you do, keep checking those blind spots. We will see you next time.
Goodbye, and thanks for listening.